Hey, friends, welcome to Better Bible Reading with Kevin Morris. Glad to be with you for another episode where today we're going to be following the same kind of trajectory we did last time. Where, if you're listening to this on the podcast, I'll do my best to explain everything, even though you don't have something in front of you to look at. However, if you're on YouTube, we're going to have some slides and some portions of scripture that I want to show you to help enhance what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we're focusing on the book of Ruth, and I'm posing the question to us, who is the main character in Ruth? This is not going to be like a detective series, so to speak, or some kind of a plot twist where I'm presenting to you some novel reading of Ruth. But instead, this is one of those helpful exercises. If you care about being a better Bible reader, you want to ask these kinds of questions when you come to any book in the Bible, but especially when you come to a book that is named after someone, such as Ruth, and you may just think, okay, well, Ruth is the main character because the book is called the Book of Ruth. And there's a sense in which that is certainly true. There's another sense in which that's not the whole story. And this is really helpful because as we're going through Bible reading plans, perhaps you remember the end of last year where I shared looking at the Bible through a genre-focused approach, where we look at maybe a genre we haven't read before, or maybe one that we really enjoy, but want to dive a little bit deeper and start asking questions as readers so that we can have a better understanding of what we have before us. The book of Ruth is an excellent example of this. In the Old Testament, when we're looking at the so-called historical books and the general division that you have in English Bibles, and you want to ask a question, especially in a short book like Ruth. It's only 4 chapters where it's very narratively driven, and there's characters, as is the case in narrative genres, where we're meant to ask questions about the people that we are being presented with. We want to know what they're like. We want to know, what does God intend to teach us about himself through these people. And so this is one of those exercises that you can take, particularly for the book of Ruth, but you can also use it elsewhere as you study the scriptures and use the same kind of approach to help you have a better understanding. So let's start with asking the question, who is the main character in Ruth? I'm going to suggest to you, so that there's no, kind of suspense here until the end of the episode or anything, I'm going to suggest to you that while both Ruth and Boaz are main characters, I want to encourage you, don't forget about Naomi. So I'm not making the argument that Naomi is the main character and not Ruth or not Boaz or a combination of the two, but that we are meant, in terms of the book as we look at it, to see the profound development and storyline of Naomi. And of course, Ruth plays a vital role in that. But we are meant to look at the life of Naomi and to see how God blesses her through the companionship of Ruth and all that happens in the book. And there is a reciprocal idea here, as we're going to see as we go through it. So hopefully this is interesting to you, and it will help you appreciate this book to a greater extent, and also, again, to use these kind of interpretive tools to help you in any book of the Bible. So let's start by interacting with the importance of bookends. Bookends simply means how a book begins, how a book ends. And oftentimes in the Bible, bookends are a key to helping us look for things along the way. A really good example of this is actually in the Gospels. So let's look at Matthew, for example, to start with. Matthew, as you know, begins with the genealogy of Jesus, and Matthew does not present us an exhaustive genealogy. It is a selective one, but the main point of his genealogy that he gives to us at the beginning of his gospel is to highlight that Jesus is two things. Number one, that he is the son of David. He has this royal Jewish status. He has a right to the throne as the king of Israel, but also that Jesus is the son of Abraham. And so you have this motif of promise that is being pulled all the way back from Genesis 3:15. One is going to come to crush the head of the serpent. You have these rival seeds, the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman. And you also have the covenant promises given to Abraham by the Lord, where Abraham is going to be a blessing through his seed to all nations. So this is what we get at the very beginning of Matthew. And it sets us up to look for these kind of things along the way. But then I want to also show you the end of Matthew. This is another familiar passage. It's the Great Commission. But perhaps you haven't noticed how the Great Commission is actually tied directly to that genealogy in the very beginning. Jesus in Matthew 28:20 comes to his disciples and says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Now, there's a lot we could say about that, but one of the things that I want to point out to you is that phrase, all authority, ties back to that kingly status of Jesus. It's pointing us all the way back to the beginning where Jesus has been identified as the Son of David, as you see on the screen. But not only is he the Son of David who has all authority, but the gospel that he is commissioning his apostles and his church through the end of the age to believe and to proclaim is comprised in this command: go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And there's that tie all the way back to the beginning of Matthew, that Jesus is not only the Son of David, but he's the son of Abraham. So Son of David, all authority; Son of Abraham, all nations. And so these two bookends are helping us see this point that Matthew is trying to drive home throughout his historical account of Christ in his earthly ministry. Now, also, we see in this genealogy, this is unique because as we're going through these names of Christ's ancestors, we see that for the most part in genealogies, it's the man that's highlighted. But there are a few exceptions to this in Matthew's genealogy. And one of those exceptions is that in the case of Ruth, we not only have Ruth mentioned, but we also have Boaz mentioned. Or maybe I should say this way: we not only have Boaz mentioned, but we have Ruth mentioned. So you have something that's pretty unique in terms of genealogies where the husband and the wife are both included, kind of to highlight the significance of what happens during their lives. So this is another clue that we can actually use, thinking beyond bookends now. It's a clue that when we're thinking about the book of Ruth, we need to pay special attention to Boaz and to Ruth. Now, that shouldn't be hard to do because oftentimes when we think about the book of Ruth, it is presented as somewhat of a love story narrative. It's this match made in heaven, if you will, between Boaz and Ruth. And that is true. And there's nothing wrong with having that approach. I'm going to highlight the significance of Boaz and Ruth first, and then I want to move into highlighting the significance of Naomi. So, in order to appreciate books of the Bible, we need to have somewhat of a navigation of genres. And here's what you see on the screen. This is just a simple categorization of what you have in your English Bible. When you open up the table of contents, you have the Old Testament, Genesis, all the way through Malachi, and then you have your New Testament. But if you look on the screen, what I've simply done is taken the typical genre categorization of the Old Testament in the order that we have in English. And we have these four genres: the Pentateuch, the historical books, poetry, and prophets. Now, something that I want you to know is while we greatly celebrate the 66 books of the Old and New Testaments as Protestants as the inspired, infallible Word of God, book order is something that is not divinely inspired. There are different orders and different ways in which we can orient the books, in this case, the 39 books of the Old Testament. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you go back, look through the history of the Old Testament composition, some books are in different orders. This is the case like with the minor prophets, for example. There's different records of different orders of the minor prophets. They don't have a huge range of fluctuation, but the order that we have is not the only order. We're following the Septuagint order, the Greek translation of the Old Testament here in our English Bibles. But you'll notice here in our English Bibles that we have Genesis through Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, and then you get to Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then Samuel and Kings. So Ruth is situated right between Judges and Samuel, and that makes perfect sense, right? Because this is somewhat of a chronological ordering when it comes to those 3 books, Judges, Ruth, and Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Ruth, as we open up the book, we're told that it happens during the times when the judges judged, during the judging of the judges. And so, obviously, that makes sense that Ruth is going to be right there next to Judges. And we also know that at the end of Ruth, we have a genealogy that leads us to David. We have, through the marriage of Boaz and Ruth, we have Obed, Jesse, David. And so there's this anticipation of the Davidic line being saved and preserved through Boaz and Ruth getting together in marriage and having their son. So that's what we have in the book of Samuel. You have the eventual rise of David. It happens later on in the narrative because first we're presented with Eli and then we're presented with Samuel, and then first we have the reign of Saul and then eventually David. But the book of Ruth is situated nice and chronologically centered between Judges and Samuel. That's what we have in our English Bibles. But what I want to show you is that there's actually a different orientation in the Hebrew Old Testament. In the Hebrew Old Testament, instead of having what we just looked at, those 4 typical genres, we have 3 main genres. We have the Torah, same 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, as you're familiar with. And then we move into prophets. Prophets are subdivided into former and latter prophets. The former prophets, perhaps you don't think about a book like Joshua being prophetic, but the reason that it's described in this way is that Moses pronounces his prophetic warnings to the children of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, and you have the covenant blessings and the covenant cursings that are going to play out in their lives depending on whether or not they adhere to God's word. And the former prophets are prophetic in that they are fulfilling and showing the consequence of Israel forsaking the Lord. And so they are prophetic in that sense, and they're anticipating in the eventual destruction of the northern and southern kingdoms. They're anticipating what's going to happen to that promise of the Davidic line, what's going to happen to the promise of a king who is to come. And so kind of intermingled with the chronological time frame of kings are the prophets. And so we have the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Again, this is just like our English Bibles in this regard. And they're called the latter prophets because they are in the kind of twilight years of what's happening with the eventual overthrow of the kingdom and subsequent exile. But these are also major prophets in that Isaiah, 66 chapters, Jeremiah, 52 chapters, Ezekiel, 48 chapters. These are big books. If you've tried to work your way through any of these 3 prophets, they are major writings. They are dense, they're thick. And so you contrast that with the minor prophets, minor not meaning that they are less important, but minor meaning that the books are shorter. And we talked about this last time when we were looking at a sampling of the minor prophets. But these are also, in the Hebrew Bible, simply called the Book of the 12. And they're included together. Again, this should be a refresher for you if you caught our last episode where we were talking about this. So you see the organization, Torah, prophets, but then we get to the writings, and the writings make up kind of a blend of what we're used to seeing in other genres. So the writings not only include the poetic and wisdom literature, but they also include the 5 festal scrolls, of which Ruth is the first. So you have Ruth, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, and Esther. These 5 books are generally read once a year, and they're surrounded around feast days, Pentecost being one of them, Passover being one of them, etc. So these books are in the writings genre. They're not in the same order as we're used to seeing them in our English Old Testaments. And so you'll notice in the former prophets, we have Joshua, Judges, and then it moves straight into 1 Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel. So Ruth is not situated between Judges and Samuel towards the beginning of the Old Testament like we're accustomed to in our English Bibles. Ruth is actually later on in the writings genre. And Ruth, if you look here, interestingly enough, Ruth is actually situated between the book of Proverbs and the book of Song of Songs. Now that's very interesting. Again, this is not inspired book order. We can agree to disagree in terms of the book order here. This is more of a thematic placement, I'm going to argue. If you think about Song of Songs, the celebration of marital intimacy, there's a lot of things we could say about the Song of Songs in terms of what exactly is it pointing to. Many Protestant Christians have looked to that as a picture of Christ and his church, and certainly there are ways in which we can appreciate that. But just taking it at face value, a celebration of marriage, it's a nice complement to the book of Ruth because it leaves off with Ruth and Boaz getting married. And so then you have this grand celebration of marriage in the Old Testament immediately following that in the Song of Psalms and the Hebrew orientation of things. But also Ruth coming right after the book of Proverbs is significant as well. I'll leave this on the screen just so you can see, and you can look this up online very easily, but just so you can see the book order is a little bit different. Daniel is in writings instead of the prophetic genre. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and the book of Chronicles, instead of being in the normal arrangement, we have them in the writings genre. So this is interesting. There's a lot more we could say about it, but just to let you know this, if you didn't, there's 3 major genres in the Hebrew Old Testament: the Torah, the prophets, Nevi'im, and the writings, Ketuvim. Those 3, we could argue if we wanted to say, okay, is there any biblical precedent for this? We could actually look at something that Christ says in the Gospel of Luke. This is verse 44. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." That's Luke 24:44. You see this threefold division that Jesus mentions: law, prophets, and Psalms. Now perhaps you say, well, Psalms wasn't that major category that you just mentioned. But if you look back on the screen, in the writings genre, the Ketuvim, the very first book, is Psalms. And so this is often the case where we think of one book in a genre as kind of the example or the placeholder to represent the totality of it. And so referring to Psalms could be kind of a placeholder to refer to the writings. Now maybe or maybe not that's persuasive to you, but this threefold division is often called in English the Tanakh. And the reason for that is simply because it's taking the first letter of each of those 3, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, so you have T, N, K, and then we just have the letter A because we can't say a word just with consonants. We have to have vowels to help us. So the Tanakh, that simply means the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. Now, I highlighted here, as you see, that Ruth follows the book of Proverbs. So what can we say about the connection between Ruth and Proverbs? We're thinking here, in particular, about the uniqueness of Boaz and Ruth highlighted as main characters. Now, again, we think about a book and what it's surrounded by, what the historical context is, but in this case, the thematic tie-in. And so what I'm going to argue here is something that we can only truly appreciate if we think about Ruth in this context. We think about Ruth as immediately following the book of Proverbs. Where does Proverbs lead off? Where does Proverbs leave off and Ruth pick up? What is that tie-in that helps us to appreciate the book of Ruth from a particular perspective? That's what we want to look at by considering Ruth and Proverbs together. Now, you know the book of Proverbs most likely has 31 chapters, and the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, is often the chapter that is preached or highlighted during Mother's Day. And the reason for that is because Proverbs 31, in verse 10 through the end of the chapter, is that grand section on the virtuous woman, the excellent wife. ESV in Proverbs 31:10 begins, "An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels." I want to highlight that word excellent to describe, as often it's translated excellent or virtuous, and highlight that alongside the book of Ruth. So Proverbs ends with the virtuous woman. That's the final word of the book of Proverbs. And then we, in that Hebrew Old Testament book order, go right into the book of Ruth. And what are we told about Boaz and Ruth? Well, this is that match made in heaven picture, because in Ruth chapter 2, we're introduced to Boaz. And during the times of the judges, when men were dogs and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, you have this remarkable contrast. And that contrast is how Boaz is described in terms of his character. Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Worthy man, or more particularly, worthy, is the same word used in Proverbs 31:10, an excellent wife. But not only is that described of Boaz, it's also described of Ruth in chapter 3, when Ruth and Boaz are speaking together at the threshing floor. Boaz says to her, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." So you have Boaz and Ruth identified as worthy. It's that same word translated as excellent. I'll show it to you here on the screen, the Hebrew. Even if you can't read it, I just want you to see this word, chayil, in Proverbs 31:10, Ruth 2:1, chayil, Ruth 3:11, chayil. It's the same exact Hebrew word that means to communicate someone's character as being especially noteworthy in the positive sense. Worthy, excellent, virtuous, honorable, highest honors in terms of their character. This is what we have presented to us about Ruth and Boaz, and it's the tie-in that points us as we're introduced to this worthy woman, this virtuous woman in Proverbs 31. Then we move right into Exhibit A, if you will, in the book of Ruth, where we see what does that look like? How does that actually play itself out in terms of this worthy woman? Well, the worthy woman marries a worthy man. So that's interesting, because not only do we have that connection of that word chayil to highlight Ruth and Boaz in terms of their character, but when you look through kind of the aerial glimpse of what this worthy woman's life looks like, what her family looks like, what her reputation is like, you move further into Proverbs 31, and I want to highlight two things for you here. In verse 23 and verse 31, I'll read them. "Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land." And, verse 31, "Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates." Now, that's really where the book leaves off in Proverbs 31. But how does Ruth interact with that? Well, let's look first at that phrase, "Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land." Now, this is speaking about the virtuous woman and her husband. He's known at the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. Now, what do we have happen in the book of Ruth? You remember the climax in chapter 4. Boaz tells Ruth that there is another redeemer who's first in line, if you will. And if he won't redeem her, then he certainly will. And Ruth goes and recounts this to Naomi, and Naomi says he's not going to rest until he settles this matter. And so in chapter 4, Boaz rises at the break of day. He goes to the gate. Ruth 4:1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate. And what does he do there? He sat down there. And then verse 3, he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. That sounds remarkably the same as what we saw in Proverbs 31:23. Her husband's known in the gates when he sits down among the elders of the land. This is exactly what Boaz does. He goes to the gate. He sits down there with the elders of the city. It's remarkable. And then in verse 11, now let's go back to Proverbs 31:31. Give her the fruit of her hands and let her works praise her in the gates. Now, what happens after the redemption transaction is fulfilled in Ruth chapter 4? Well, you have this response in verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. They're witnesses to the vow that Boaz just took and the redemption right that he just made claim to. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. This is remarkable because the city people at the gate praise Ruth. They praise her for her works. They rejoice in the woman that she is. And then this other blessing goes to Boaz. May you act worthily in Ephrathah. There's that modified use of that word, chayil, as we see here, and be renowned. Literally, it says, and make a name for yourself, or get a name for yourself. Now, think about that, going back to Proverbs 31:23. Her husband is known in the gates. And so you have this interesting fulfillment of the ideal picture of the virtuous woman and her virtuous husband in Proverbs 31 played out and fulfilled in the storyline of Boaz and Ruth. What is said of the virtuous woman here in Proverbs 31 and her husband is precisely what we see played out in the book of Ruth. Now, that is remarkable. Certainly, when we come in that book order of the Hebrew Old Testament and we appreciate what we see in Proverbs 31, and then we move right into the narrative of Ruth, you can start to connect those dots. You can start to have a greater appreciation that this is not just some random love story. This is not merely trying to get us to King David, but we have this profound contrast of two people that are quite unlike how people were typically liked during the times of the judges. These people were honorable in the sight of the Lord, and he blesses them as such. He gives them worth and renown. He makes their name to be remembered, and that's precisely what we see in Matthew's genealogy. Their names are remembered. Boaz and Ruth situated right there to highlight that when we're thinking about Christ as the son of David, that's only possible because of the remarkable life of Boaz and Ruth. And this is a beautiful connection. And so I really want to highlight, just to further appreciate what we see about Boaz and Ruth in that book. But now let's pivot. We don't want to say that the book is only about Boaz and Ruth because there's a third main character, and that is Naomi. And to appreciate Naomi, we want to appreciate this same idea that we've talked about at the very beginning, the idea of bookends. Bookends tell us what we should be looking for along the way. Bookends highlight for us what is the story trying to accomplish? What is it trying to show us? And how can we more greatly appreciate the book? Well, we appreciate it by looking to the bookends and then working our way on the inside elements. So what are the bookends in the book of Ruth? Well, we see this introduced to us in the first 5 verses. I'll read them for us, and we'll consider what exactly are we to take from this. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So you're presented, and this is a bit of an interesting twist. Maybe we could just say a pivot is maybe a better word. In that most of the time when we're reading scripture, it's highlighting the life of a man. So, for example, the narrative of Abraham focuses on Abraham. It doesn't focus on Abraham for a little bit and then pivot to this huge focus on his wife, Sarah. It really does focus on Abraham. It maybe pivots a little bit to Sarah with her conflict with Hagar, but that's about it. Contrast that with the book of Ruth, where only 2 verses in, you get to verse 3, and there's an immediate pivot. And that pivot happens because in almost no sooner are we introduced to Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, that he dies. And suddenly, as soon as that happens, there's this profound shift. There's this pivot. And the pivot is like having the stage light. It was on Elimelech, and then it shifts over, and it's focusing on Naomi. And it locks in place on Naomi, and it stays on Naomi. And we are meant to understand as the story unfolds through that spotlight of Naomi, through that vantage point of Naomi. Not only does her husband die, but to add insult to injury, also her 2 sons die. And so here you have Naomi without her 2 sons, without her husband. She's here in a foreign land in Moab, and she has these 2 daughters-in-law. And the question that we're meant to ask is, how is the lot of Naomi going to be reversed? How is the lot going to fall into pleasant places? This is a profound question. You feel the weight of her loss and her undoing. This is what's unpacked throughout the book of Ruth as we get a little bit further into chapter 1, and we see her plight. We see her sorrow and suffering. And we're wondering, are things going to be reversed for her? Is there any future for Naomi? Is she just going to follow the same sad end that her 2 sons and her husband met, and that is death in a foreign land outside of the covenant community of God's people? Is that's what's going to happen to Naomi, or is there going to be something better? That's the first of the 2 bookends. But then you look to the end of the story, and this is not the very, very end of the story, because the end of the story is actually a genealogy. And that is for us highlighted in chapter 4 of Ruth, and it picks up in verse number 18 through 22. So what I'm saying in terms of the bookend here, this is the bookend of the narrative proper, if you will. So it's kind of like an epilogue when you get to verse 18 and you have the genealogy. You could, of course, say that that kind of ties us into the genealogy that Matthew begins with and then picks up the names of Boaz and Ruth. But really, the bookend of the narrative proper is verses 13 through 17 in the book of Ruth, chapter 4. Let me read these for us, and we'll think, what does this tell us about that first bookend in the first 5 verses of chapter 1? Well, here's what Ruth 4:13 through 17 says, So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. It's very interesting when we get to Ruth chapter 4, because you assume that what's being played out is a love story. And there is a huge sense in which that is true, as we've already looked at the connection to Proverbs 31. But it's interesting that when you get to chapter 4, Ruth, having just had that encounter with Boaz at the threshing floor, Ruth really does take a back seat. Ruth is not present at the city gates when the redemption rite is being interacted with by Boaz and the unnamed Redeemer. Instead, what actually signals the transaction as a whole is the fact that Boaz says Naomi is selling her plot of land. And so the whole thing is focused primarily on redeeming things for Naomi. Then, at the kind of tail end, when it looks like the unnamed Redeemer is actually going to take the job from Boaz, if you will, Boaz includes that it's also Ruth that is to be considered here. It's Ruth who is to be taken as a wife, and it's Ruth who is to bear children to perpetuate the name of the family who has perished so that they would be preserved. At this point, the unnamed Redeemer says, okay, that's me biting off more than I can chew. I'm not going to do this. And he bows out. And so Boaz comes in and fulfills the totality. He goes above and beyond. And he is a worthy man in that respect. So what we see here in verse 13 is that Boaz does take Ruth. She does become his wife, and they have a child together. It's not just that they have a child, but they have a son, and so the family name is perpetuated. But immediately there's a shift in verse 14 back to Naomi. Then the women said, you would expect here in this love story of sorts that the women are going to look to Ruth, and Ruth is praised. But primarily the women look to Naomi. Naomi is the one who is blessed. And think about this. It's not just that Naomi is blessed, but that the Lord has not left her without a redeemer. Who is this redeemer? Well, in one sense, it's Boaz. In terms of the letter of the law, Boaz is the redeemer. But in a spiritual sense, in a restoration of life sense, in a reversal of her lot of bitterness, the redeemer is actually Obed. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. So that's how we know that this praise about the one who's going to restore life and nourish, bring Naomi back to what her name means, pleasantness. The one who's going to do that is Obed. Now, of course, at the high level, Obed is doing this, but it's really the Lord himself who's doing it through Obed. So the Lord is the ultimate redeemer. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. The way that Psalm 19 ends, the Lord is the ultimate redeemer. Christ, Jesus, is the ultimate redeemer. But through the life of Obed, the Lord is communicating his loving redemption towards Naomi. And it's a redemption of a full character arc, if you will. It's a redemption that takes her from a state of bitterness in chapter 1, where the bookend signals, and it restores her back at the end of the book. And this is so fascinating. Even as we look at this in verse 17, the women of the neighborhood, not only do they look to Naomi and bless her in verse 14 instead of Ruth, but they look to Naomi in verse 17 and say, a son has been born to Naomi. And that's just profound because Boaz and Ruth had Obed, not Naomi. But you see, the blessing here and the intent here is that what Naomi says to, at this time, Orpah and Ruth, back in chapter 1, is that she loves them deeply. She prays that the Lord will bless them. She prays that they will find rest with their husbands, whom they have yet to have after having lost their first husbands. But she says, look, I'm too old to get married. I'm too old to have children. And even if I could have a husband and a child this night, even though I'm too old for that, even if I could, what are you going to do? Wait around for the child to grow up and so he can become your husband? And that's just assuming that she can have two boys anyways. And so basically her mindset is, if I could help you, I would help you. But the greatest help that I can have for you is to tell you to get away from me. And so the Lord would bless you, because here I am in this just profound state of bitterness and sorrow and loss and emptiness. And that's what she says to Orpah and Ruth. And she persuades Orpah to go her own way, but Ruth clings to her. And you can see, as the narrative goes on, that Naomi and Ruth are hand in hand. Both of them make the totality of their lives in chapters 2 and 3 and 4, after they get back to Bethlehem, the totality of their lives are focused on the well-being of the other. And that is just a beautiful way in which we can see that Naomi never stops being a main character just because Ruth is highlighted. But Ruth is a main character, in particular, focusing on the way that she is caring for Naomi. And so they're both the main characters here. And then, of course, in chapter 2, you get the introduction of Boaz, and he becomes the main character. So really, the argument that I'm trying to make is, don't forget about Naomi, because she represents the bookend. Don't forget about Boaz and Ruth, because they represent the grand Chayil man and the Chayil woman, these worthy man, worthy woman, as emblematic in Proverbs 31. All three of them play a profound role, and really we shouldn't say that any of the three of them are subservient to the other. They both have their unique angle and thrust in the 4 chapters of Ruth. But when we think about chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4 in the book of Ruth, we really should highlight the fact that even though Ruth meets Boaz, Ruth goes out to the field because she wants to care for her mother-in-law. And when Boaz meets Ruth, not only does he bless Ruth, but he ensures that she brings food back to her mother-in-law. And so Boaz is concerned with Ruth and Naomi. Naomi is concerned with Ruth. Ruth is concerned with Naomi. So there's this just interesting way in which they have this selfless love for the other. They're not worried about building up themselves. Even once Ruth gets this great amount of respect among the people, which is profound in and of itself because she is a Moabite, she doesn't decide, okay, I've kind of made a name for myself now, I'm going to go my own way. No, she just continues to be with her mother-in-law. She stays with her mother-in-law all the way through the end of the barley and wheat harvest. And you get to chapter 3, and Naomi looks at her, and she has this recollection of what she said back in chapter 1. In chapter 1, she says, "May you find rest in the house of your husband." So in chapter 3, she's basically looking at Ruth. She realizes, here's Ruth. She's not going anywhere. She has just shown me again and again how much she loves me and cares for me, and she's not interested in forsaking me. She meant what she said when she said, "Let nothing but death depart us from each other. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay," etc. Now Naomi looks at Ruth, and then she says, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you?" And so this is an interesting thing that kind of gets lost because we don't think back to chapter 1. But Naomi had originally said, "May the Lord grant you rest." And now in chapter 3, she's already seen that Ruth has taken this pursuit of blessing in her own hands for the well-being of Naomi. So now Naomi is wanting to take this pursuit of rest in her own hands for the sake of Ruth. Naomi wants to care for Ruth, and she's having this thought of maybe the Lord is going to bless her through me. Maybe the Lord can yet use me, even though I have lost everything, so that I can be a blessing to my daughter in law who loves me dearly. And so that's how the threshing floor begins. It's actually a plan that Naomi has. Naomi gives Ruth the playbook, and she tells her line by line what she's to do. And then she says, and then when she get to the certain point, Boaz is going to take it over from there. And so we often praise Ruth for her character and what she does at the threshing floor. Maybe we should say it this way: what she doesn't do at the threshing floor, as would have been typical for like cult prostitution and idolatry and all the rest of the kind of things that would happen during the times of the judges. I mean, people were wicked. That's why Boaz is there keeping watch over the threshing floor so nobody comes and takes everything away. And you would imagine this cult prostitution and idolatry to take place as was common. But instead, Ruth and Boaz show themselves to be worthy people. They don't fall into sexual promiscuity. So Ruth is to be commended in this regard, but she's also simply following the playbook of her mother-in-law, Naomi, who tells her exactly what to do. And so this is very interesting in that we see, as the narrative unfolds, Naomi never takes a back seat. She's the one that gives permission of where Ruth is to go and what Ruth is to do in chapter 2. Ruth runs it by her to make sure it's okay. Then Ruth gets back, she recounts everything to Naomi, and then Naomi gives her assessment about Boaz. And then in chapter 3, Naomi tells Ruth what to do. Ruth goes and does it. Ruth comes back and reports to Naomi, and then Naomi says, don't worry, Boaz is going to take care of everything. But then we see this interesting shift in chapter 4 that Naomi has actually taken things into her own hands even further. So she's instigating and initiating the need for the Redeemer to act because she's selling her plot of land. And of course, we know that she's not doing this for her own good. She's doing it for the good of her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And the townswomen, after everything is said and done, praise Naomi. And they praise Naomi by saying, your daughter-in-law loves you dearly. She has done this for you. She has borne you a son. And so there's just layer upon layer upon layer of this fascinating way in which we can analyze these characters. We can appreciate how profound they are in the history of God's redemption as he's bringing it about through the life of Naomi and Ruth and Boaz. And we can begin to have a greater appreciation for not missing out on any of the highlights. We don't want to sideline Naomi just because Ruth comes to the forefront. And we don't want to sideline Ruth just because a son has been born to Naomi. All of these intermingle, all of these go together, and they tell this rich story. And things like bookends, themes like thematic book placement, are tools that can help us to appreciate these kind of things. And so as we close things out here on this episode, hopefully this has been food for thought for you. And hopefully you are going to be able, by God's help, to use these kind of tools to really enhance your reading of any book of the Bible, especially narrative books, though. You can use these kind of tools and signals. Think about, what book is it around? Where have I heard this before? It doesn't even necessarily have to be the case that you're just looking to the book that just left off before this, but you're thinking, where have I heard these themes? Where can I look to in the Psalms? Where can I look to in the wisdom literature? Where can I look to in the prophets that really enhances this idea? And these are ways that we can just have not only a greater accumulation of Bible knowledge, although that's good, but knowledge alone is not good. It puffs up. But ultimately, this should drive us towards greater love and affection for the Lord himself, the grand author of the book, the grand orchestrator of all the events, the grand fulfiller of all the promises, the one who makes good on his word. And this should really cause us to celebrate and worship our great God for this profound storyline that he has given to us in the Bible. So thanks for watching this episode and listening. Again, if you've listened to this on the podcast, please feel free to go back and check on YouTube where you can see the slides on the screen. I'll have at least one more of these kind of things for us to consider in the coming weeks. But again, this is a little bit different format, but I wanted to just have something where you can look and follow along. And hopefully it's been of benefit to you. I'd love to hear your feedback on it. And maybe if there's another theme or some kind of idea that you'd like me to tease out later, let me know. I'll be glad to incorporate it in this kind of study. But until I see you on another episode, take care, and I'll see you real soon.